Rizwan, for that introduction. I'm going to present a paper on technoscience. It won't directly concern algorithms, but maybe we can, in the discussion, figure out the connection. The paper is called Two Approaches to Technoscience. I'll talk about both an empirical and a philosophical approach. I can't see anything. The lights are so bright. Oh, well. That's how it was. Yeah. The term technoscience was introduced in the 1980s in reaction against the then dominant image of science. That image was based on a certain understanding of theoretical physics, the most basic of basic sciences. Theoretical physics is a mathematical discipline that appears on the surface completely remote from the world of technology, both in terms of applications and experimentation. Physicists in their ivory tower were said to input data from experiments and their equations, leaving the applications to engineers and other lesser under-laborers. This image of physics as a pure intellectual discipline was supported by positivist philosophy of science, which became dominant in philosophy departments in the English-speaking world after World War II. The philosophers who introduced the term technoscience proposed a more realistic image of science. They argued that science is essentially connected to technology. They pointed out that science has always had an applied aspect and that its vision of nature depends on what can be done with technological instruments and experiments. I sympathize with this view of science for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But the term technoscience needs serious qualification, as I will also explain later in this talk. I'm going to begin now with a little personal history that helps to understand what is right about the concept of technoscience. This is personal because I grew up in the midst of theoretical physics. My father was one of the young students sent by their universities to Germany in the 1930s to learn quantum mechanics at the source. By the early 1940s, he was working in the physics department of New York University. Around this time, Einstein wrote to Roosevelt proposing that the U.S. attempt to develop an atomic bomb. One day, a colleague came to visit and asked where they could speak in absolute privacy. On the roof of the apartment building in which my father lived, he extended an invitation to join the Manhattan Project. My father declined for reasons he never really explained, and instead went to work on the development of radar. His work on radar resulted in patents on improvements to a special type of vacuum tube called a klystron. This is a very powerful generator of shortwave radio waves. Some years later, my father was invited for the summer to Stanford University, where the klystron was invented. There, he and his colleagues worked on the design of the Stanford Linear Accelerator, a high-energy machine which was used to accelerate electrons to relativistic velocities. I was about 10 years old at the time. The wife of one of my father's Stanford colleagues organized a little crystal radio club for the children of the physicists. While the dads were working with radio waves generated by klystrons, we kids were figuring out how to detect a radio signal with a chunk of silicon. So what is the point of the story? Physics may well have had all the abstract characteristics described by positivist philosophy of science, but it was no problem for a theoretical physicist to work on technology when his country needed him to. One would not expect a literature or history professor to find this such an easy transition. And it was also possible for that work to lead to new instruments for detecting features of nature that had never before been seen, leading to further progress in pure science. Here, the concept of technoscience is validated in its main outlines. Because I lived this validation in my childhood, I was never interested in positivist philosophy of science. I managed to avoid studying it and instead have always focused on technology. This has given me a somewhat different perspective on technoscience from most scholars in the field of STS. There is a tendency in that field to try to obliterate completely the distinction between science and technology. But that worries me because it opens the door to political regulation of science on the same terms as technology. Routine regulation of technology protects us from many hazards, but one would not want scientific theories to be similarly subject to politics. The Russians tried that with genetics and killed the science in their country for 50 years. Today, Trump is engaging in the same kind of manipulation of climate science. Let me interject something here. This, by the way, takes me back to the question of critique and Latour's attitude toward critique. A few years ago, I heard him give a talk on climate change in Vancouver, and he explained that there were different sides and you had to pick your side because science is not just about a consensus that everyone shares. Very good. But then the students in the audience were puzzled. How do you choose sides? And one of them said, could you use political economy, maybe, to figure out which side was scientifically valid? And Latour said, yes, why not, you know? And on the way out of the lecture hall, I ran into him, and I said, Bruno, you don't know it, but political science is just a Canadian code word for Marxism. He was shocked. And of course, I mean, the student was right. You want to know if it's the Koch brothers financing fake news about climate change, that's a good reason not to believe it. If it's a respectable climate scientists who spent their lives becoming experts, then you have some reason to believe them. So critique in the good old-fashioned sense, I think, still has a sphere of application because we live in a corrupt world in which we need it. But of course, it's not the only form of critique. As I argued earlier, we also want to be able to criticize institutions and algorithms and technological designs, and that involves a different operation from suspicion of underhanded motives. Okay, so I conclude this paragraph. I said that Trump is engaging in the kind of manipulations the Russians engaged in with respect, this time, to climate science. From this point of view, one sees the advantage of the positivist view of science. By isolating science completely from the world of technology, one protects it from being regulated like any other technical system. There's an interesting history behind this aspect of the question of technoscience. The sharp division between theory and application was instituted by the 19th century research university, the university which we inherit. Pure science was granted the dignity of a disinterested search for truth and located alongside fields such as literature and history, from which no practical or pecuniary application was expected. This supported the independence of science and the right of science to pursue problems of basic importance. Scientists saw themselves as intellectuals involved in higher culture on terms similar to literary scholars or musicians. Of course, there have always been important applications of science, even as it was institutionalized in the ivory tower in the late 19th century. That was also when vaccines and artificial dyes were invented by great scientists. But maintaining the idea of pure science was still important for legitimating work that had no obvious practical value. The emphasis changed after the Second World War. 3 scientific innovations played an important role in the Allied victory. These were the atom bomb, radar, and cryptography. After the war, the American military saw science as a key factor of power in the Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. The military proposed to fund science while bringing it under direct military control. This implied rigorous security, secrecy, and draconian punishments for violations of the new regulations. Scientists resisted and succeeded finally in creating the current system of grants and contracts administered by universities. In this way, they protected their independence while benefiting from the vastly increased funding available for scientific research. The ideology of pure science played an important role in the success of this compromise with the military. Let the scientists pursue what they called the endless frontier of research in the university, and eventually useful applications will trickle down. This background helps to understand the social function of the ideological notion of pure science. The fact that the personal experiences and activities of scientists contradicted the ideology was easily overlooked. The purity of so-called pure science was no obstacle to scientists relying on ever more complex technologies in their explorations of nature, while contributing ever more applications to the military and the economy. The tension between the idea of pure science and the technoscientific reality has been eroded in recent years by the rise of biological sciences as the new paradigm science, replacing theoretical physics. The distinction between pure and applied science breaks down in biology to an unprecedented degree. A great deal of biological research is directly supported by pharmaceutical companies and other businesses seeking profits rather than truth. And the consequences are exactly what the scientists feared from military control, namely secrecy and corruption of research by external forces. Of course, there are still obvious differences between most work in science and most work with technology. These differences cannot be erased by a clever terminological invention such as technoscience. Clearly, the problems faced by truck drivers and construction workers are rather different from the concerns of theoretical physicists and even pharmaceutical researchers, although they all use technology. It makes no sense to confound them all in a universal technoscience. The concept of technoscience has a role in demystifying claims of purity that are now far more unjustified than they were in the period before World War II. But it must be deployed with discretion. We still need a distinction between what we now call technoscience and ordinary technology. I have suggested a definition of technoscience based on these considerations. I propose we reserve the term for scientific research that has an immediate role in the development of applications. In such cases, theory and application are not separate phases that can be pursued in isolation from each other, but are pursued simultaneously. This is the case where the experimental apparatus is a prototype of a future technology. Pharmaceutical research is an obvious example. But in the conclusion of this paper, I will propose a broader application of this concept of technoscience. So far, I have been describing the social world of science. The concept of technoscience introduces a more realistic picture of that world than the earlier vision of pure science. But it also raises a fundamental question. What is it about scientific thinking that lends itself so readily to technological application? What is it about science that ties it to a world seen through technology? Something more basic than social theory is necessary to answer these questions. I want to now consider how several philosophers have attempted to explain the connection between science and technology. I will begin with Martin Heidegger's reflections on science and technology. I will then discuss Marcuse's related reflections. You should know that Marcuse was Heidegger's student and offered an alternative to Heidegger's views in his famous book, One-Dimensional Man, which I'm sure you've all read. Heidegger and Marcuse share a key concept. This is the transcendental notion of object construction. Each field of research defines a specific kind of object through its methods and concepts. In one sense, this is obvious. Physics, for example, considers matter in motion, while biology considers life, and so on. But what makes these philosophers' approach interesting is that they regard such definitions as only the beginning of a far more detailed specification of the way in which a certain cross-section of reality is carved out for investigation by the sciences. For example, the modern scientific projection of a quantifiable idea of nature is quite different from the idea of nature in earlier times. This approach emphasizes the role of the subject of knowledge in a way that excludes common sense realism. Neither Heidegger nor Marcuse deny that science studies reality, but given the role of the subject in object construction, there is no reason to grant science an exclusive license on the truth of the real. Other object constructions may reveal other aspects of the world, hidden to science by the limitation of its construction of its objects. Heidegger argues that modern science is radically different from ancient science and cannot be compared with it. The concept of progress is irrelevant here. This difference stems from different conceptions of nature. Ancient science considers nature as self-moving, self-creating. Its model of nature is clearly derived from biological growth. Modern science conceives nature in terms of what Heidegger calls a ground plan that anticipates in advance the sort of things that can appear as objects of research. Heidegger's example is physics, for which nature is stipulated to consist of a self-contained system of motion of units of mass related in time and space. A self-contained system of motion of units of mass related in time and space. Motion here means only change of place in a uniform continuum. This definition of the object suits it to the establishment of exact mathematical magnitudes. This explains why modern science relies on mathematical procedures, since it has defined its object in advance as the sort of thing that can be measured and counted. Heidegger then draws the conclusion that modern science produces what he calls a world picture, that is, a representation of reality that is taken to be exhaustive. Reality is simply what can be represented by science. This seems obvious to us. Science gives us an image of the cosmos we accept as a more or less accurate picture of reality. But according to Heidegger, this is a uniquely modern way of understanding the real. Ancient Greece, for example, in Heidegger's account, did not identify the essence of reality with a representation, but with the phenomenon of growth. The Greeks encountered a self-creating, self-moving nature characterized by intrinsic potentialities. Their reality moves from one level of actualization of potential to another higher level as it develops. The same word, kinesis, signifies this sort of change and also mere movement in space. The developmental process cannot be measured in quantitative terms and gives rise to no theoretical picture. Instead, it posits a meaningful nature with its own life independent of the subject. The modern scientific picture of nature eliminates this notion of self-movement and intrinsic potentiality. Nature is meaningless and utterly dependent on the subject, for which it serves as a raw material available for instrumental control and domination. The interconnection of science and technology lies in that original ground plan which exposes nature to both representation by science and control by technology. Now, Heidegger intended this theory to be critical in some sense, but not anti-scientific. Rather, it was the whole modern way of being in the world that he called into question. What troubled him most was the absorption of the human being into the ground plan of science as just another object subject to representation and control. Sun Ha's paper gave us a good example of what that means today. But he did not blame science for this, but rather the spirit of the modern age. This critique of modernity leaves very little room for conceiving an alternative. Heidegger rejected the sort of thing that we think of as New Age re-enchantment. Using myth or religion in order to reestablish meaning in life would simply instrumentalize these spiritual resources and so recapitulate the original problem of universal technification. He offered no way out, and in his last interview said, this is a quote, "Only a God can save us." I want to turn now to Marcuse's alternative approach, which has much in common with Heidegger's, but offers a more hopeful solution. You're probably aware that Marcuse taught at this university, although no building has been named after him, which I think is a shame. I did my doctoral work with him here, and that ultimately set me on the path of research on technology. But as you'll see, I have some differences with his approach. Marcuse's discussion of science follows more or less along the lines laid out by Heidegger. He too regards the basis of science as a certain concept of nature which exposes it to quantification and control. The essence of modern science is the elimination of intrinsic potentiality in favor of measurable facts. What the Greeks thought of as potentialities of the object are no longer considered any more significant than the arbitrary goals of human subjects. Our model of technical action is not cultivation, but clear-cutting. This surrenders science and technology to the prevailing social power, since reality itself no longer offers any guidance for action. Marcuse quotes Heidegger as saying, quote, "Modern man takes the entirety of being as raw material for production and subjects the entirety of the object world to the sweep and order of production," end quote. Marcuse's analysis differs from Heidegger's in arguing that this instrumentalist conception of nature is not due to modernity as such, but specifically to capitalism. He argues along the lines anticipated by Husserl that science is based on practices of quantification and control in everyday life that it refines and develops. Since this would explain why modern science has arisen at the same time as capitalism and has turned out to serve it well. Attributing the rise of science to a specific socioeconomic system suggests the possibility of change through historical action. Marcuse was a Marxist who believed that a revolution would modify not only economic arrangements, but the very conception of nature. A socialist modernity would integrate science and art in a new conception of nature and a new, more benign technology respectful of nature's potentialities. Marcuse thus looked forward to the recovery of the idea of potentiality, banned from the modern scientific idea of nature. Although difficult to defend philosophically, this notion appeals intuitively to our sense that things have gone terribly wrong in recent times. For example, we do believe that human beings have potentialities that can be frustrated or realized depending on their social and economic circumstances. Nature appears to us increasingly threatened by our crude technological assault on its integrity. In some sense, this suggests that nature has potentialities we can favor or deny. Nevertheless, it is difficult to see how modern science could function in the context of a different concept of nature. Marcuse seems to have been aware of the difficulty because he rejected the notion of a qualitative physics as an alternative to the science we practice today. That would be a science like Aristotle's that identifies the essences of things rather than measuring them. But essences are by definition qualitative. Quality is precisely what is at stake in the notion of potentiality. So how does Marcuse intend to avoid regression to qualitative science? Furthermore, in the absence of a scientific ground for the identification of potentiality, what grants our notion of it objective status? Aristotle did not have this problem because he took his culture's conventional ideas of potential for granted. Heidegger, too, did not need to confront this problem because he left the future in the hands of God. That's a good solution, but Marcuse projects a human future, humanly created, in harmony with the potentialities of nature, and so faces great difficulties. Marcuse developed these ideas in the early 1960s. At that time, there was no visible environmental movement nor any other significant social movement that challenged science and technology. Social science was so strongly imbued with positivism that it offered no useful starting point for the sort of cognitive reform Marcuse envisaged. As a result, his suggestions are very abstract. He argues that art is the repository of an idea of potentiality that is neither conventional nor subjective. If art could infuse science with purpose and meaning, a different idea of nature would emerge. This does not seem very convincing today. Although, in fact, Marcuse did suggest that the problem was to somehow make values intrinsic to the scientific project, an idea which I think has some validity. But still, I think we're skeptical of this idea of merging art and science, and we need to think of other ways of resolving the problem that Marcuse set himself. We have concrete ways of envisaging the reform of technoscience today based on actual social movements in domains such as environmentalism. Unfortunately, Marcuse did not return to his theory of science to revise his earlier views in response to these movements. This is our task. From our perspective today, we can make sense of his position in a somewhat different way than he intended, while remaining faithful to his argument for potentiality as an aspect of nature. The empirical study of science today has made the point that the boundary between science and technology is far fuzzier than was assumed at the time Heidegger and Marcuse developed their theories. They discovered a quasi-transcendental link between science and technology, independent of the empirical trends traced more recently by historians and sociologists. The point was not that science was applied or relied on instruments to perceive the world, the empirical points, but rather that science conceived nature as the sort of thing that could be measured and controlled. Marcuse proposed an alternative concept of nature's potentialities. He reimagined the scientific object construction in a new socialist context. But it turns out that we have not had to await a socialist revolution to see fundamental change in the concept of nature. Already the reaction against the destructive aspects of capitalist technology has motivated significant changes neither Heidegger nor Marcuse anticipated. Sciences now proliferate that operate across the boundary between science and technology maintained by scientific institutions in the past. Technoscience is not simply a function of the concept of nature, as Heidegger and Marcuse argued, but a present disciplinary reality. Technosciences that barely existed for these philosophers are now central to our vision of science. And potentialities play a role in some of these sciences. For example, consider ecology. This science employs the standard methods of scientific research. It conceives nature along the lines of physics, chemistry, and biology. Quantification lies at its core. But at the same time, it is animated by what traditional philosophy would call a conception of the good. It is dedicated to explaining nature in terms of ideals of health and sustainability that refer to potentialities of its objects. Climate science, for example, does not have an idle interest in the composition of the atmosphere, but is entirely oriented around predicting effects that will impact human civilization. The object client did not even exist as we know it today until it was constructed by this science. Climate science is not simply applied to policy, but arises from it. The potentialities of the natural systems that favor human civilization are not arbitrary goals, but must be articulated through the concepts developed by the sciences that posit them. Sustainability refers to conditions under which the environment can support human life. From the standpoint of pure science, the Earth can get along fine without us, but fields such as climate science are predicated on the problem of human survival and serve that end by defining thresholds of change. Technoscience, in this sense, answers Marcuse's requirement that science recover a notion of potentiality. We could extend this argument to other disciplines as well. Urban planning, architecture, epidemiology, medicine, even certain types of management theory can all be developed around a concept of the good of the population they affect. And this good is not simply a subjective wish, but flows directly from the study of human needs and capacities in the contexts in which these disciplines intervene. Here, the constitution of the natural object for research and the application of theoretical knowledge through technology form a single whole that cannot be disaggregated into mechanically separated parts. Of course, there is a division of labor between different aspects of the network formed by researchers, their instruments, policymakers, and technical experts. But each aspect of the network is defined by its relation to the whole. And that whole posits a nature which has the intrinsic potentiality to favor human life. In conclusion, I think we can find a use for the concept of technoscience. It is not just a question of business financing of research in pursuit of short-term applications, as critics of the concept hold, nor is it particularly interesting after the death of positivism to point out that science depends on technological instrumentation and experiment. That's common knowledge. The concept of technoscience must also be carefully distinguished from the larger domain of technology, in which science plays only a minor or routine role. The autonomy of science from direct political control must remain an essential feature of our concept of technoscience. But with these limitations, the concept can serve to help us understand the emergence of new disciplines that incorporate science as we know it in a larger framework that recognizes the imbrication of nature and humanity. Okay. So,
now we have time for Q&A. So thanks for this talk. Mr. Feenberg, I have a question about a subject which has been discussed this morning in the first talk. Do you believe that we can say that in all the history of science, we find technoscience?
we find what?
Technosciences.
Yeah.
This is the first question, and a subsidiary question. If not, if you do not agree with this thesis, can you tell us what is the specific epistemologic thinking of the technoscience in your view? If you do not believe that we can, in a kind of backward thinking, put technoscience like in Greek science.
Mm-hmm.
Greek science, in my view, Greek sciences exist but are not technosciences, and they do not apply, they do not induce the kind of epistemology I believe is specific to technoscience. And perhaps we have discussed today, just for example, you know, I can perhaps prolong my question. In my view, the operationalist epistemology we discuss with the case of the QI, you know, this is an operationalist epistemology to think that I do not know what is intelligence, but I decide to say, to tell that the concept of intelligence is produced by the procedures of measuring what I don't know.
What I'm measuring.
Yes. So do you believe, as I believe, that it is a very specific epistemology of the technoscience of the 20th century?
You know, the first Greek philosopher was named Thales, and there are two great stories about him. He predicted bad weather and got all the olive presses under his control and made a fortune. So this is technoscience, right? But it's also told of Thales that one day he was walking around looking at the heavens and fell into a well. And an old lady pulled him out and said, "You should keep your eyes on the ground." So that's the ivory tower, right? So Thales already exemplifies both images of science. But I mean, I guess I don't believe that it's a very useful term if it refers to everything people have done in terms of knowing nature. To say it's definitely true that there's been a connection between science and application and instrumentation wherever there's been anything you would want to call science. But I think something different happens in modern times that creates modern science as a unique phenomenon. I agree with Heidegger. It's different from Greek science because it has a different conception of nature. And I mean, the term technoscience arose in a specific polemic context, right, as a way of getting out of the positivist image of pure science, the scientists in the ivory tower fantasizing nature in some way that had no connection to any, dirty money or business or technology. And that image of science had a protective function for scientists at a time when they were under some kind of attack, right? Because they were so useful, they'd proven so useful. But I don't know. I mean, I would like to find a good use for the term technoscience, but one that's sufficiently limited that it actually is a useful concept and doesn't just refer to everything. If it refers to everything, then it's sort of doing in a word the work of an analysis, of a theory of science. So maybe that's useful. I'm not sure, because I think the polemic context is pretty much dead. So now we need a more specific definition of technoscience to make it a useful term in our discussions. Anyway, that's my view. But, it's just a word, so you can do anything you want with it. And someday it'll all sort out and become a standard term, but it hasn't happened yet.
So you're talking about this moment when you mentioned a moment in which technology and science comes together into this particular formulation, again as a moment of polemic. Yeah. I'm also thinking about the moment when the modern meaning of the word technology came into view over the later 19th century, when there was this there was a strong sentiment that they were trying to express with that word, which is something unprecedented is happening, that we are entering a time of amazing and, again, singular progress through these things, and therefore we need a grand word to explain and fill what Leo Marx calls a semantic gap, and that was supposed to be technology. Yeah. And we go back further with the Enlightenment and early modern science, and we find a similar self-historicizing trajectory where they say science is how we break out and we solve the quarrel of the ancients. And my question to you, because you've talked about this kind of a historical step we're taking and the moment we're in now, what kind of vision of the future of technological and scientific enterprise are we thinking of when we are trying to rebalance these kinds of words and concepts? Specifically, I guess one way to ask this question is, what do you think about the Marches for Science, which has been, for example, this moment of saying, can we try and restore the purity of science by claiming science as a point of moral authority, but at the same time, can we bring the scientists out of the tower and into the streets to more boldly push for certain kinds of political action? So I'm curious about how you see these kinds of moments in our contemporary moment.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting situation because on the one hand, we have these emerging sciences like climate science and sciences that have a social and public mission that is supported by the general public. So it's not, they don't need to be in the ivory tower, but they do need protection from political interference and commercial interference. So there's a tension there which nobody really has, figured out how to address. I mean, when science was originally natural philosophy, right? And it was like philosophy, separate from business, and technology for the whole of human history has evolved independent of what we call science. There wasn't nothing like what we call science until quite recently, but technology evolved fine. So, and then even in the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the technological evolution took place through tinkering by people who had no scientific qualifications. They figured stuff out because there was something in the air, right? This transcendental conception of nature that operated on people both as scientists and as technologists. So then you begin to get some convergence in the 19th century, and in the 20th century, the convergence is so strong that now most new technology has a scientific basis, and the sciences are busy using technology to study nature. There's not much any other way to do it. So, so that convergence has resulted, at the same time as that convergence has taken place, the power of science and technology, of technoscience, is so great that the world now threatens to destroy its human subjects. So these new sciences that are trying to save us have emerged in that context. And then in this context, it makes no sense to talk about a restoration of the ivory tower. The sciences are now part of the public sphere, but they have to be in the public sphere in some way that protects their integrity. And that's proving to be quite difficult to work out. That's very complicated. They need to be more open. I mean, the original idea was you isolate science from public opinion because the public doesn't know anything. They're a bunch of ignoramuses whose ideas about nature are all wrong. So protect us from these guys. But today, it's much less, there still are, of course, people who don't want to get vaccines for their children and so on. There's all kinds of ignorance still afloat. But there's also a lot of people who are reasonably informed and who make a contribution by supporting the mission of science. So the situation is quite confusing, and nobody really, I think, has a clear idea how to operate in this new environment, where science has to be more open to the public. It can't close itself off. It can't just be responsive to political power, because political power is manipulating it in ways that are dangerous for its own mission. On the other hand, it can't be independent, completely independent, because it exists through funding mechanisms, institutions, and so on that are state supported. So I think, I guess I don't really have an answer to your question, but I mean, the dilemma is clear, and it's clear that this has to be worked out in the public sphere through a process of democratic debate and with a conflictual element in which we finally arrive at a new configuration of the relations between the state, the general public, and science.
One quick question, and then one sort of further speculation. The quick question is, I wonder if when we're talking about technoscience, we don't actually mean engineering. Because it seems to me that the work that technoscience does is actually the kind of work that happens in engineering departments, which is to say applied science. Mm-hmm. That's what I've always understood as technoscience, and it seems to me that this dichotomy that you're playing itself out, that you're sort of teasing out, is actually very much already been worked out within the academy in terms of, you know, applied mathematics and engineering and all those kinds of places that are conduits for the application of science in everyday life. In fact, I often think that, you know, maybe Latour is actually just talking about engineers, and he's not, or he's talking about scientists as engineers, right, mm-hmm. as craftsmen. So that's more of a question and observation. The other question, though, is I think, you know, a little bit more difficult that I had, and it has to do with it does go back to the question of contemporary digital technology, mm-hmm. Because now the sort of dominant form of science doesn't actually require, first of all, state funding in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. Google doesn't require state funding. I mean, they require tax cuts, but they don't require state funding. They, you know, they're egregious in a whole other ways, but they're not dependent on federal funding. And I could, afterwards tell you a story of an experience that I had with somebody in the industry that came to one of our conferences at UCLA and yelled at us because we had nothing useful to give him, and that he could operationalize, and he had $100 million he was hoping to invest.
You just missed the boat there.
Yeah, no, we weren't gonna give him a reason to invest in $100 million in our ideas. But basically, what I'm saying is that we actually it's no longer this dichotomy, right, between science and technology. But in fact, as a result of the sort of emergence of computational technology and the success of a lot of these mega businesses, we do have bodies that are totally independent, right? And that in fact are these conglomerates of scientific production.
To the first point, the division between science and engineering is an artifact of the late 19th, early 20th century, right? And it presupposed the very concept of pure science on the one side, and separate out the applications into a separate profession. And the scientists remained in the university, protected from outside influences to a great extent, while the engineers worked directly for corporations. They didn't become like a consulting profession like medicine, but they had staff positions in business organizations. And so in a way, the original configuration of science and engineering is precisely what made it possible for the positivists to posit this notion of science as a pure intellectual exercise. So I think when people introduced the notion of technoscience, it was because they were resisting that division and trying to bring together what had been separated institutionally in the early 20th century with the invention of the engineering profession. So I think the term actually has a rather different meaning than, it's not engineering. It means something different. It has to do with this merging of science and technology in a single entity, which you can then project backward. You can project it backward and argue that this was already the case in earlier times, and to some extent that works as a way of thinking about, say, Pasteur or German science at the end of the 19th century, but Liebig. But it's most convincing in relation to post-World War II science and technology, where really the interaction becomes just so intense that you can't separate them. So that's for the first point. The second point, yes, of course, corporations now do fund directly a lot of scientific research. And that poses, that's good for science. It gets the money, the 100 million, but it also poses problems like the one you encountered when you met this Google guy, that he wanted you to do something you didn't want to do. Or maybe it was just something you couldn't anticipate doing. He needed to give you more hints as to how to get his money. So that's part of the problem, I think, because in the corporate world, the interests at stake in the organization of science are very different from the epistemic concerns that science should normally be oriented toward. And that has consequences. Now, there were corporations like the Bell Labs was created by Bell, in which scientists did work just as independent as if they were in a university. But that model has not prevailed. Instead, we get much more mission-oriented and competitive notions of how corporate science should work, and it's disturbing. It's worrisome. We want more connection between the social world and science than was envisaged in the old pure science ivory tower notion, but we don't want that to lead to the corruption of research or its application to inhuman purposes. So there's a need for lots of more state intervention, I think, on behalf of the public into this process of corporate science. I mean, just one example, pharmaceutical companies do not have to reveal the experimental, the course of the experiments they run. So it's been known, for example, for a company to have a success for the first 6 months of an experiment, and then the next 6 months things go to pot. And they just publish the first 6 months of results and get a drug approved that actually has no efficacy. So this kind of thing can happen but it should, I mean, you want the pharmaceutical company to be involved and pay money for research, but you also want it to be illegal for it to manipulate the results of the data and fool the public. You want the scientists to have some basis on which to resist corrupt activity. And that should be a legal basis, not just, sacrifice their career. So I think state involvement is important, even in a techno-scientific moment.
What if the positivist version of science as pure science and Aristotle's version of nature are both equally dead? I think a very strong case can be made for that, and that we will not be able to revive either Aristotle's concept of nature nor the positivist version of physics-oriented science. If that is the case, then the opening of what you had to say about technoscience as a praxis-oriented interpretation of science makes more sense.
Well, I guess I would certainly agree that there's no way to restore the original forms of these two historic types of science. But I think there are things in them that are still valid and somehow have to be combined in new ways or worked out in new ways in order to create this science of the future.
When I first read your paper, I thought that I agreed with it all. Now I think that you are much stronger with respect to the survival of philosophical approach to science and technoscience, etc., than I am.
It's possible. I definitely do believe that there is an issue of object construction, of the way in which the world is conceived, that underlies both science and technology. And there has to be some kind of change in that to respond to what's happening today. But not a change which would subvert the accomplishments of modern science or regress to some conventional notion of human life. We need somehow to move forward. I think of this as going forward to nature, not back to nature. And we have to bring with us what we've accomplished with modern science, but also what we've learned about the conditions of our own survival and existence on planet Earth. And that has a normative aspect, which you could formulate as potentiality without necessarily regressing to an Aristotelian essentialism. Maybe the term is not exhausted, but can have a new life in this context. But I'm not sure. I think that maybe your emphasis is much more on the empirical side. Then that might be the difference between our positions.
I will admit that I used to be a Heideggerian. I'm no longer a Heideggerian, but I think there's an interesting application of a notion of his, which is called being towards death. Being towards death is looking at the contingency and finitude of being human. And unfortunately, he should have applied that to technology. Technologies also are being towards death because they have shelf lives. And the longest shelf life of anything I know is an Aucolian hand axe, which stayed the same for 1.4 million years. No cell phone stays the same for 1.4 million years, and I don't predict that any of the technologies we have today will be around 1.4 million years from now.
Well, we've got a problem with fossil fuels that's going to accelerate the shelf life of that particular technology. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I'm not a philosopher, but I was thinking more about your reluctance to consider a closer relationship between art and science. And I was wondering about the term techne and whether you could say a little bit more about whether Heidegger and Marcuse disagreed on what techne was.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Techne is the Greek term from which we derive the word technology, but the Greeks used it for any kind of craft making. So Phidias had a techne just as much as a shipbuilder. And the merger of art and technology in a single concept in ancient Greece suggested to Marcuse that a restoration of something like that, to recover the unity of the imagination and reason and technical reason, as the Greeks had done. I just can't figure out how to make that work. However, I do retain one piece of it. The idea that the imagination must be involved in science seems to me right. Why? Because potentialities must be, today, functions of the imagination, at least in part. They can't be derived simply from cultural conventions as they were for the ancient Greeks. We have to make them up. We have to invent them. So we invent a certain way of being in a city, a certain way of handling our energy needs or whatever. And these inventions are imaginative, and they are the way in which we make potentiality function for us today. And this, I think Marcuse thought that art could play a great role in this process, but I don't see how. Perhaps indirectly, but directly I don't see how. But I do think that the idea of joining imagination and reason in a new configuration can make sense of this idea of a technoscience that is both scientifically rigorous in the traditional sense of the term, but also oriented toward potentialities. You had a second question about whether Heidegger and Marcuse agreed on the concept of techne? Yeah. I think, I think they understood the Greek word in the same way, but in Heidegger's view, art had become simply an experience for modern man and no longer revealed the world. In other words, those potentialities that slumbered in nature and which could be unveiled by artistic creation, that belonged to a different era. Instead, now art is just an experience that people can have, therefore belongs to the world of technology, and no longer has a redeeming function. He does, at the end of his essay on technology, he does mention, he says, perhaps art can recover the power of revealing at some future time, but he has no program of reform. For Marcuse, the revealing power of art is still alive. It's just that he doesn't, in my view, seem to know how to integrate that to his idea of technology.
Thank you. I just want to say that we're 15 discussion in a more informal setting, and have Caleb deliver a few minutes of kind of a summary of what we learned during this conference, and we'll continue.
We just want to thank Professor Andrew Feenberg for giving a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.